Sunday mornings were sacred in our house. Dad had a tradition, his world-famous funny face pancakes. He always insisted they were Michelin star worthy, though the smiles were usually a little lopsided. The kitchen was alive with the sizzle of batter hitting the pan and the scent of maple syrup in the air. Mom hummed along to some upbeat tune, wiping the counter like she had all the time in the world. I was sprawled on the couch or clutching Mr. Snuggles, my well-loved teddy bear, and half watching cartoons. Claire Bear! Dad's voice rang out from the kitchen. Get in here and help me create some pancake magic! I jumped up, leaving Mr. Snuggles behind, and ran to the kitchen. What kind of magic? I asked, giggling. He waved the spatula like a wand. The kind that makes your mom smile and you laugh so hard milk comes out your nose. Gross, I said, but I couldn't stop laughing as I grabbed a plate and pretended to inspect his work. Looks like the faces need more syrup. Lots more syrup. Mom turned from the counter, rolling her eyes. If you two keep this up, I'll be outnumbered by sugar addicts before lunch. Come on, Sarah, Dad teased her, flipping a pancake. Life's short. Eat the syrup. It was a perfect moment, one of those you wish you could freeze forever. But then, life has a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. The spatula clattered to the floor. Dad's hand shot to his chest, his face twisted in pain. Sarah? His voice was barely above a whisper. Tom. Mom's voice cracked as she rushed to him. I stood frozen, clutching the edge of the counter as the room spun around me. Claire, call 911. Mom yelled, shaking me from my trance. My hands fumbled with the phone as Dad slumped to the floor. The pancake on the stove burned, filling the kitchen with smoke, but none of us noticed. The paramedics came quickly, but time seemed to stretch endlessly. Mom clutched Dad's hand as they loaded him into the ambulance, her face pale but composed. It's going to be okay, she said to me, though her trembling hands betrayed her words. I wasn't allowed into the ambulance. A neighbor came to sit with me, but her presence felt distant and strange. All I could hear were the sirens fading into the distance and the echo of Dad's laughter from just moments before. Hours later, Mom came home alone. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the world had pressed her down. Claire, she said softly, kneeling in front of me. Her eyes were red, her voice hollow. Daddy's gone. I stared at her, the words not making sense. Gone where? She swallowed hard, pulling me into a tight embrace. He's not coming back, sweetie. The house changed overnight. The warmth Dad had brought disappeared, leaving behind a void too large to fill. Mornings became quiet. Mom stopped humming. The funny-face pancakes were gone, replaced by cold cereal and hurried silences. Weeks passed, and then Mom sat me down one evening. Claire, I want to talk to you about someone I met, she said, her voice hesitant. Someone? I asked, suspicious. His name is Steve. He understands what we're going through. He's been through it too. Is he going to make pancakes? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her face fell, and I regretted the question immediately. She didn't answer, just squeezed my hand. Steve came into our lives quickly after that. He was nice enough, with a steady presence and a knack for fixing broken things around the house. But something about the way Mom smiled at him made me uneasy. It wasn't the smile I remembered her giving Dad. Life moved forward, whether I wanted it to or not. And even then, at 8 years old, I had a feeling the quiet days were over, and the storm was just beginning. By the time I was 12, Steve had settled into the role of stepdad with a calm patience that felt almost supernatural. He wasn't Dad, but he was steady, kind, and endlessly practical. The house, however, no longer felt like ours. It revolved around one tiny, chaotic son, Brandon, my baby brother. At first, I didn't mind. Brandon was small, cute, and loud. He cried constantly, but his chubby cheeks and toothless giggles won over even the hardest hearts. Except, as he grew older, it became clear Brandon wasn't just another kid. He was the kid, and the rest of us were merely background actors in Mom's new production. Claire, could you bring Brandon his bottle? Mom called one afternoon as I sat on the living room floor trying to finish a book report. He's 6, Mom, I replied, not looking up. Shouldn't he be using a cup by now? Mom's head popped out from the kitchen doorway, her eyes narrowing. He had a rough morning. Just do it, please. Reluctantly, I got up and delivered the bottle to Brandon, who sat sprawled on the couch watching cartoons. He didn't even glance at me as he grabbed it. Thanks, he muttered, eyes glued to the screen. Steve walked in just as I was returning to my spot on the floor. He looked at the scene and shook his head. Sarah, don't you think Brandon's old enough to pour his own drink? Mom spun around from the kitchen, holding a spatula like it was a weapon. He's still a child, Steve. He needs support. He needs to learn, Steve countered, his voice calm but firm. Claire was making her own sandwiches by the time she was his age. Claire is different, Mom snapped, her tone dismissive. She's more independent. Or maybe she had to be, Steve muttered under his breath, but loud enough for me to catch. I pretended not to hear, burying my nose in my notebook. The years passed, and Brandon's quirks turned into something far less endearing. His room was a war zone of unwashed clothes and broken toys. He had no interest in cleaning up after himself, but Mom didn't seem to mind. Claire, be a dear and tidy up Brandon's room, she'd say, as if it were a natural part of my duties as the older sibling. One day, I finally snapped. Why can't Brandon clean his own room? I asked, glaring at her. Mom sighed, her patience wearing thin. Because he's busy with his schoolwork. Schoolwork? I snorted. You mean playing video games? That's enough, Claire. Mom's voice rose, and for a moment she looked like she might argue further. But Steve appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. She's right, Sarah, Steve said, his tone low and serious. You're not doing him any favors by treating him like he's helpless. Mom's eyes flashed with anger. I suppose you think I'm a bad mother now? No one said that, Steve replied, his voice steady. But Brandon needs to take responsibility for himself. The argument escalated, as it always did. I sat at the dining table, pretending to be absorbed in my homework while their voices echoed through the house. Brandon, of course, remained blissfully unaware, laughing at his cartoons in the next room. It all came to a head one evening when Steve suggested signing Brandon up for Little League. He needs to be part of a team, Steve argued over dinner. It'll teach him discipline. Absolutely not. Mom's fork clattered onto her plate. Do you know how dangerous baseball is? He could get hit by the ball or twist his ankle. That's life, Sarah, Steve replied, exasperated. You can't shield him from everything. Mom's lips tightened. I'm not shielding him. I'm protecting him. I couldn't help myself. Who protected me? I muttered under my breath. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Both Mom and Steve turned to look at me. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mom waved a hand dismissively. Claire, this isn't about you. But it was. It always had been. And as I stared down at my untouched mashed potatoes, I realized that as long as Brandon was around, it always would be about him. Later that night, Steve knocked on my door. You okay, kiddo? He asked, leaning against the frame. I'm fine. I lied, staring at the ceiling. Steve sighed. Sometimes people get so focused on one thing, they forget to see everything else. Is that why you stay? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Steve hesitated, then smiled sadly. I stay because someone has to remind you that you matter. I didn't respond, but his words stayed with me. In a house where Brandon was the star, Steve was the only one who still saw me. By the time I left for college, and Brandon was already shaping up to be a professional freeloader. He barely passed high school, spent most of his time gaming, and blamed everyone but himself for his failures. Mom, of course, was his biggest cheerleader, constantly making excuses for him. Brandon just needs time to figure things out, she said one evening during my last week at home. I was packing up boxes for my dorm room while she hovered in the doorway. Time? Mom, he's almost 17 and doesn't even know how to make a sandwich, I replied, shoving a stack of books into a box. At this rate, he'll be 30 and still asking you to tie his shoes. That's not fair, Claire, she shot back, her voice defensive. He's sensitive. Not everyone can be as independent as you. It wasn't worth arguing. I had learned by then that nothing would change her mind about Brandon. Instead, I focused on leaving, with Steve's help. He drove me to campus on move-in day, hauling my boxes up 3 flights of stairs without a single complaint. You've got this, Claire, he said as we stood in my tiny dorm room. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Mom didn't come. Brandon needs me, she explained, citing his anxiety over her being away for too long. I didn't bother to hide my disappointment. College was my fresh start, and I thrived. Weekly calls home were mostly to Steve, as Mom was too busy catering to Brandon's ever-growing list of needs. By the time I graduated, Brandon was 20 and still living in the basement, surrounded by empty chip bags and a permanent glow from his computer screen. During one rare visit home, I tried to talk to him. "Brandon, want to grab lunch?" "My treat," I offered, leaning against the doorframe of his cluttered room. He didn't even glance at me. "Busy," he grunted, clicking furiously at his keyboard. Gunfire echoed from the speakers. "Doing what? Winning a Nobel Prize in Call of Duty?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Mind your own business, Claire," he snapped, turning up the game volume. At dinner that evening, Steve brought up the idea of Brandon working at his construction company. "It's a starting point," he said, cutting into his steak. "Everyone has to start somewhere." Mom's reaction was immediate. "Absolutely not. Brandon is too intelligent for manual labor." Steve's fork paused midair. "Intelligent?" He let out a humorless laugh. "He can't even take out the trash without a reminder, Sarah." "Don't talk about him like that." Mom's voice rose, her cheeks flushed. "You don't understand him." "No, I understand him just fine," Steve replied, his voice steady but sharp. "What I don't understand is why you let him get away with doing nothing." I sat quietly, watching the tension rise like steam from a boiling pot. Brandon wandered into the kitchen halfway through the argument, grabbed a soda from the fridge, and left without a word. Later that night, Steve found me in the backyard, sitting on the old porch swing. "I tried, Claire," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But your mom? She won't hear it." "She never will," I replied, staring at the stars. "Not as long as Brandon keeps giving her excuses to baby him." Steve sighed. "I worry about what's going to happen when I'm not here anymore." I didn't know what to say. The thought of Steve not being there was one I couldn't bear to entertain. A year later, that fear became reality. Steve collapsed at work from a heart attack, just like my dad. When I got the call, I rushed home, but he was already gone. At the funeral, Mom put on a performance worthy of an Oscar, sobbing loudly and telling everyone what a wonderful husband Steve had been. Meanwhile, Brandon showed up in wrinkled sweatpants and spent the service scrolling on his phone. Afterward, I tried to talk to Mom about what came next. "You need to think about how you're going to manage, Mom." "Brandon needs to step up," I said gently. Her face hardened. "Don't you dare judge him, Claire. He's grieving in his own way." "Grieving?" I scoffed. He didn't even look up from his phone. "That's enough." Mom snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You have no idea what it's like." I didn't argue. What was the point? As I drove back to my apartment, the realization hit me. Mom didn't want Brandon to change. She needed him to stay dependent because it gave her purpose. And me? I was just the outsider in a story that wasn't mine to tell. 2 years after Steve's funeral, I had built a life I was proud of. I had a steady job, my own cozy condo, and a sense of independence that felt hard-won. Then Mom called, her voice shaky with desperation. "Claire, we're in trouble. Brandon's trying so hard to find work, but these employers don't appreciate his talents. We're barely getting by," she said. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "What do you need, Mom?" "Just some support. A little help with the bills until Brandon gets back on his feet," she replied, her tone almost hopeful. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I set up monthly transfers, but as the months passed, the requests kept coming. First it was groceries, then the water heater broke. Then Brandon needed a new gaming chair because his back hurt. Each time, I told myself I was doing the right thing. During a visit home, I finally saw how bad things had gotten. The house was in disrepair, peeling wallpaper, a leaking faucet, and a carpet that looked like it hadn't been vacuumed in years. Brandon was sprawled on the couch, his gaming headset on, surrounded by empty soda cans. "Nice to see you too, Brandon," I said, setting down a bag of groceries. He barely glanced at me. "Yeah, whatever." I walked into the kitchen where Mom was stirring a pot of spaghetti. "Mom, this place is falling apart. What's going on?" She waved me off. "It's fine, Claire. We're managing." "Managing? You've been asking me for money every month, and it looks like none of it's going to this house." Her spoon clattered into the pot, and she turned to me with a defensive glare. "How dare you talk to me like that? I'm doing the best I can." "The best you can. Brandon's 22, and he's done nothing but play video games and mooch off you. When is enough enough?" Before she could answer, Brandon stormed into the kitchen, yapping leaking, headset still around his neck. "What's your problem, Claire? I don't need your judgment." "And I don't need to pay for your lifestyle," I snapped back. The tension was unbearable. I left that night, furious and drained. A week later, I got another call from Mom, but this time it wasn't about bills. "Claire, I think it's time you knew about the will," she said, her voice unusually tight. "The will?" I asked, suspicion prickling at my skin. "Yes," she admitted. "I've decided to leave everything to Brandon. He'll need it more than you." I let out a bitter laugh. "Of course he will, because heaven forbid he ever has to earn something for himself." "It's not like that," she protested weakly. "You're successful, Claire. You don't need anything from me." "No, Mom," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't need anything from you, but I hoped for once you'd see me as more than just a backup plan." The conversation ended abruptly, and I knew something had irrevocably broken. A month later, I canceled the monthly transfers. The fallout was immediate. Mom left angry voicemails accusing me of abandoning the family, while Brandon sent texts full of passive-aggressive jabs. Then came the final twist. One evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Brandon standing there, holding a stack of papers. "What is this?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Mom's suing you," he said with a smirk. "For financial abandonment or something? I don't know. She thinks you owe her." I stared at him, disbelief turning into fury. "You've got to be kidding me." "Nope," he said, shrugging. "Guess you're not so perfect after all." I hired a lawyer the next day. What followed was a messy legal battle that made local headlines. Daughter fights back in family feud. The courtroom was a circus, with Mom painting herself as the victim of my supposed selfishness. Brandon, ever the star of his own show, sat smugly beside her. But the judge didn't buy it. The court ruled in my favor, even ordering them to repay the money I'd given. Of course, they didn't have the means, but the judgment was enough. It was closure. The last time I saw Brandon was in the parking lot after the hearing. He muttered something under his breath, but I didn't care enough to ask what. As I drove away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Back in my condo that night, I poured a glass of wine and stood on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in years, I felt free. Raising my glass to the stars, I whispered, "This one's for you, Steve. Thanks for teaching me to stand my ground." And with that, I closed the chapter on them, ready to write a new one for myself.